I have Michael Stott with me today as my guest. Michael is an urban designer and strategic planner who has spent the last 20 plus years working on projects around the world with extended periods in Australia, Asia, Canada, Europe, and Middle East. In his practice, Michael focuses on creating compelling place led solutions to increase quality of life of community residents through projects at different scales and different strategies. He is the director of Urbis, a network with the main goal to shape the cities and communities of Australia for better future. He is also a regional leader at Placemakingx. Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I am Asban Sari, the founder of the organization Peacemakers Pakistani, and I am bringing you the stories of placemakers, artists, and professionals from around the globe about how they created an impact and made change happen. You are listening to the Making It Happen show. Thank you for joining in. Enjoy the episode. Hello, Michael. Thank you for joining me today. I've been waiting for this interview for so long. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So, how are you and how is it going? And how was the pandemic year and everything in Australia and with you?
Well, interestingly, so Western Australia just went back into lockdown yesterday, which was a bit of a surprise. But the rest of Australia currently is looking quite well. In terms of Brisbane, where I live, it's been interesting because it's not been as badly affected as other places in the country. So we're quite lucky, although some of us, we've all gotten sick and different things for different reasons at different times, but it's been a challenge, but a different kind of challenge. And I think what we're mostly concerned about in Australia is how we can use and leverage what we've learned throughout the COVID pandemic to kind of help others in different places around the world, because I think we're further along the spectrum. Things with myself too are good. Always fun to be busy, working in different places in different ways. Although I read something the other morning on the psychology of Zoom calls and how Zoom calls are actually more fatiguing than other in-person calls because of the intense concentration you have to have as both kind of actor and audience at the same time. So although things are changing for us around the world, I don't think Zoom and Teams are going to be the final way that we communicate with each other. And I'm looking forward to being able to talk to people in person and visit people again in person. So what the rest of this year is going to hold for us all globally.
Great. Okay. I guess we had our first call in the start of November, and I knew since that day that if I'll interview you, what will be the topic and what will be the questions I'm going to ask you. So let's start with the question answers. Okay. So tell me first,
Sure.
how did you become a placemaker, and how did you find your passion about public spaces?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and one that I've had some extra time, as many of us had, working from home early on in the pandemic, and something so I've spent a lot of time reflecting on it recently. And for as long as my memory can go, I've always had a great love of cities. And then as I kind of grew older and started studying and doing different things, I started to recognize the importance of the role and potential public places and space have in linking together a range of issues in cities. And so in cities, we have spaces of protest, spaces of celebration, gathering, recreation, commerce, play. All of them have an important kind of role in the city's ecosystem, and they provide the stage where life can actually happen. And so this way of thinking, I think, has really shaped both my studies early on in my career and how I've approached my career throughout the years, and especially in terms of designing spaces and places. And so whether it's a small urban plaza or an entirely new city or community, how all of these things work together has really been a part of my process. And I think too that my continued passion for public places, or even my renewed passion post-COVID, It comes from my understanding of the opportunity great places have in generating an emotive response from music. So either in the person who is actually in the place or from the place itself, which I think is a really interesting concept. And so places, whether existing or by accident, newly designed, they are incredibly powerful and full of potential because they provide people with an identity, but then they also can help people realize their identity too. So I'm full of amazement for these things and really view cities and placemaking as the kind of the places where color, imagination, and life comes together. And so interesting, like I said too, with this kind of weird moment of reflection that we've all probably had recently, is that uh, although it's 20 years ago now, but in university, the role of place in cities was also actually quite important. And it wasn't until I actually thought about really my dissertation that I kind of started to put things together even for my own self. And so in my master's dissertation in school, I looked at the links between environmental psychology and place attachment, and how people form emotional connections and associations in place, both positively and negatively, but also how these connections and associations guide behavior and identity. So I guess it's fair to say cities have always been on my mind, and places have always been on my mind. But really, they've been on my mind because cities are more than just a collection of buildings and monuments. They're a collection of places, and that's really what excites me about working, living, designing, and being in cities around the world.
Awesome. Okay, so your presentation titled The Joy of Place on Festival of Places by Placemaking India platform was quite interesting. And I love the fact how you shared your personal insight to how you see the spaces and people connection. And also how you didn't miss to mention the way your family interacted and enjoyed in the place. So indeed the place has to be about joy so people can go there again and again. Tell me, how did you realize that a place has to be about the joy?
So here's a great way that we can think about it. If you close your eyes for a second and think about your favorite place. So tell me when you have that place in mind. Okay, so think about, what do you like to do there most? What can you see? What can you hear? What can you taste? What do you think about? What do you love about it? How do you feel when you're there? It's probably joy if you're thinking about a place that excites you. And so as a designer, I'm really passionate about creating kind of these walkable, sustainable communities by way of physical placemaking. And based on my experience and the kind of past 25 years now of working, what I've realized is that people form attachments to places they love and contribute to, especially as they invest and reinvest in those places over time. And so joy is an intense momentary instant of positive emotion that makes us laugh, smile, jump up and down. Happiness, on the other hand, is a feeling which develops over time. And so I really believe that we have an instinct in us to find joy wherever we are in the physical world. And it's an instinct that's also connected to our mental health and well-being generally. So I love this idea that joy that you can derive from places, it can be hidden in plain sight, and it can be found pleasure and happen purely by accident or through a serendipitous encounter. And it's really this idea of how great it is that physical, tangible elements can trigger intangible joy. And I think too, joy, of course, is only one of the emotions that place can trigger. And I think it can also trigger great sadness, it can trigger reflection. There's so many places in the world that we're so lucky, and they all have different and multiple layers of meaning associated with them, not always joy. And so really, although joy is the focus of what I like to talk about, and creating places people love, the important thing is that a place evokes a sense of emotional attachment. How I really started around this idea of joy evolving from creating a sense of attachment and love of place.
Great. Yes, the place I imagined was basically Wall City of Lahore, the historical area, and the love. Why I love that space is because of the people life. There are people out there and from different homes, and they are just there and adding vibrancy to the place. I just love that memory of being there and hearing and the smell of food and different noises at different times. That's something that brings me joy because it makes me feel alive. It makes it just uh, I my all senses
And
are
you look
there and
happy talking about it, right? Like
yeah.
you're telling me about it, and I can imagine it, and you look happy as you're telling me about it because you want me to share that experience in terms of what brings you joy from that place. So
Exactly.
I love hearing people describe to me the places they love and places that bring them happiness because the way that people's facial expressions change, the kind of the gestures, and people really they want to tell you about all of these things that bring them happiness about a special place to them. And I think that in itself derives another connection, which although I haven't been to the place, makes me want to go there and feel these things that you're explaining to me.
Oh, yes. The power of storytelling as well. Yes. Oh,
Absolutely.
yeah. Okay. So in our meeting earlier, you said small impacts feel like nothing, but it does matter to people who have immediate contact with the small intervention. If it matters, it is worth doing it, which means basically small interventions create bigger impacts. So share one or two experiences how it had done for real. But before that, share your first small project with me.
Well, there's this idea that doing something is better than doing nothing, and a lot of small things can add up to really big change. And so, in the case of small community projects, they can really work to create more inclusive public places. They can democratize place. They can create safer places. And there's lots of different examples from around the world where they've successfully transformed places that were violent, criminal, unsafe into inclusive, safer, more livable places through small incremental change. Some of these public spaces, from Karachi, Medellin, Mumbai, Honduras, that the common point to them was that they started small and they showed how transformation was possible through people taking ownership through these small moves, whether that's chalk art on the ground in front of your house, or that's a message of kindness on the wall on the gate of your house, or even just we have a lot of community little libraries where people can share books freely, and those have now been even gotten into food and recipes and all sorts of wonderful things, which are very small incremental changes. So it's this idea of creating inclusive public spaces where people feel a part of them and feel ownership, and it brings about this sense of belonging and togetherness, which in turn transforms these environments, whether indeed it is kind of Karachi or Mumbai or somewhere else, or it's your local community where you live. And so I guess even related to the joyfulness thing is that besides bringing joy to the person who has contributed to creating this public space, which other people also derive joy from, is that every citizen, every community member, in each and every community can benefit from these small amenities. One of my favorites too is the shop owner that leaves a bowl of water for people with pets that walk by. How great is that as a small intervention, which makes people feel more part of their community and gives people that sense of inclusivity, that they're welcome there. And so I think that these small things really add up to a lot of things. And I don't even mean in terms of the physical sense of it. It's this kind of, again, this emotive sense in terms of feeling like you belong somewhere and feeling like you're a part of that community and that you really matter.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so what do you think
Okay.
how small community projects empower people?
Right. So part of people's empowerment comes from being in an inclusive or feeling like they're in an inclusive space. So much like I was explaining in our previous conversation, answer to your previous question, is this idea that these small moves empower people to feel like they belong, and it gives them both the opportunity to feel like they can make real change, but also the opportunity to participate in making that change happen. And when we start to realize too that we all have the means to do these things, they don't have to be costly, is that we start to realize that actually we can shape our environment around us and actually manage our lives a bit differently so that we feel a greater connection. Now, this can be as simple as talking to your neighbor over the fence, or having something out front of your house where you say free for others to use or to have, or donating toys to the local park where other kids can come and play with them, or like I mentioned, having a message of hope and endearment in chalk on your driveway. And I think these little moments of connection really make people feel invested in creating these livable spaces and these communities around them, and give people a sense of belonging to something bigger than just themselves.
And how small interventions can help in having livable spaces, and how do you define livable spaces?
So livability is an interesting thing, and it's often much talked about in my profession in terms of where the most livable place is and this kind of thing. But I think actually what makes a place livable is when you know your neighbors, when you know the people around you, when you have opportunities to create connections and to create moments that are relaxed and enjoyable, and to know that there's others around you that you can rely on or tap into as you need. And so for me, livability is as much about our connection to each other as it is having a close connection to local shops and parks within walking distance, and other amenities that go into the more physical designed response. And oftentimes, I think it's important to remember that you can't always design in livability. Livability also comes from those who actually live there and have invested in that place. So I think placemaking as the impetus for livability to happen, I think is 100% correct. And I think it's through people's investment in the places around them, particularly in their immediate neighborhoods and communities, that really make them more livable. And oftentimes too, when we travel, we like to go to places where, oh, let's feel like we're with the locals, or let's feel what it looks like to be a local and live like a local. That's because there's something evocative about that place that draws it to us and makes it feel inherently livable and like you want to be a part of it. So what I try to do in my own work is kind of work to design things where those kind of chance encounters or serendipitous encounters, like I said before, can actually happen, and facilitate where we can really feel emotionally connected and invested in a place.
Right. While just listening to you, I just felt like that livable spaces are the places where we feel alive. Yeah, we are actually being alive and living in the moment. There must be those
Exactly.
opportunities.
So
Yeah.
first place, right? And then life, then buildings. It's Jan Gehl, his famous kind of axiom about it. And that sense of livability, you're right. It's very much about us and about each other.
Yes. Okay, so share your experience regarding working with people for inclusive communities and how you inspire them to contribute. Like we human live in certain patterns and we get used to it and we think that we can't manage life or routine the otherwise. So tell me about your struggle in those times of convincing people to find strength and opportunities in areas where they are already living in.
Yeah, well, there's an interesting thought around that, and I like this question because it gets to the idea that sometimes we feel so disenfranchised from what's going on around us that we don't feel like our efforts will be rewarded or recognized, will make a difference. And so often the toughest communities to work with are those which do feel like they can't make a difference, or that this is just going to happen anyway. And I think this stems from, in a lot of cases, people coming to them and asking them to react to something. So react to something that's already designed, for example, rather than co-create that design outcome together. And I think it's only when we actually start to really design with better intention in terms of community-led design and coming together with people and hearing their stories and using our expertise, yes, to design things, but to do it together. I think that's when it starts to change. And so you can imagine in large cities around the world where development is happening and feels out of people's control, people present in opposition to it because they feel like they're being marginalized by what's happening and that there's nothing in it for them and nothing in it that recognizes what they've personally invested in creating that place that exists already. And so oftentimes we do these little placemaking things to make them feel connected, back connected to the place in absence of even talking about a development proposal or something else that's going to happen. And we really try to get them to explain their story of that place so that we make sure we don't miss it. And it's hard when people come up. Oftentimes these meetings in some communities are very confrontational because they've just had too much for too long of not being heard. And so I think the first thing we have to do is give them that voice and show them how that voice can be realized through doing little things in their community. And so you have to start first, I think, by building a relationship with people and then coming back to co-create and design the outcome that you want. So relationships first, again, our connection to each other is a kind of common thread through all of this, is more important to establish than to just come in and steamroll them with ideas that are already preconceived without the local context.
Yes, I agree totally. Okay, so I've been waiting to ask you this question. Tell me about your experience with people and impact the small road crossing created around the textbook stores in Pakistan. Tell me that story.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite memories, and I can't remember. I was trying to think the other week whether it was Jumbo Books or the Said Book Bank, but the story is actually bigger than that. The story is about history and narrative of Islamabad, and that when Islamabad was newly built as a capital of the independent Pakistan, it was actually the old bookshops that gave the neighborhoods a spirit and character beyond a kind of new built city. And each bookshop used to have this distinct identity, which was unique. And I'm so fascinated by this. I really do love it. And so when I first visited Islamabad, I think it was in 2006. Bookstores are so great that the kind of, this character and identity is infused with where people come to have these literary adventures and learning and share knowledge. And I thought this was so incredible. And so when we decided, I got the opportunity to go to the shop. I think it was Jumbo, which I believe is now closed, but it was so incredibly difficult to get to the actual shop through the maze of roads and cars and motorcycles. So how people actually got into the shop to have these amazing collective discussions and to get together and buy books, I couldn't even figure out how they got there. So I decided that we needed to figure out a way to directly intervene, and rightly or wrongly, we decided to create a safe way for people to navigate from the street to get into the bookshop, but then also to define a place at the end of it where people could actually gather outside of the shop for those who had bought something and maybe wanted to have a discussion. So we created this sort of temporary place it was a really simple intervention, and we did it just using the materials that we could kind of gather in and around and the various other areas. And we didn't have any permission. We just kind of did it. And the amazing thing is that people treated it like it had always been there, and it was a natural thing, just an extension of the bookstore, more like the kind of outdoor living room of the bookstore that then became more welcoming. And people just naturally started to use it and go to it. And it was such a simple thing, but it had such a great impact. And honestly, I can think of hundreds of places, both in my community and around the world, in these various cities that I've been lucky enough to be and visit. And they could all use this same treatment, the kind of immediacy of, here's a problem, let's come together, let's fix it. It just takes that initiative and that willingness to try. And I think it's really exciting. And so this is, some years ago now, but I just remember as seeing there was an intuitive way to get to the shop, and all we had to do was kind of make that route, and we did, and it's one of my favorite memories of my first visit to Islamabad.
Yes, and I remember you told me this before, and I was very happy to hear that out. Okay, so share your experience of your visit to Pakistan and working with professionals here, and how was it different from other Asian countries?
Well, what's interesting is that it's not so much the difference is as the sameness in terms of people again wanting a chance to be heard and be a part of the solution rather than have it designed for them. I mean, there's nothing worse in my experience of a bunch of people who don't live somewhere coming in and telling you what's best for you. And so I found people were really collaborative and wanted to participate. And what I loved was we always started with some tea or a meal, and this has been the same in other countries I've worked in around the world. And so again, the kind of relationships came first before we even talked about the project, and kind of learned a little bit about people's families. Had the opportunity to kind of see the place we were looking at through their eyes, and so but also I think too to understand and have them tell us how hard certain things were in what they were experiencing and what they were doing, and how their lives really the things that they were looking for when we were talking talk to them was about just the simple changes that they thought could make a huge difference. The availability of something where they didn't have to drive or rely on somebody else to take them, where they could get fresh fruit and vegetables on a regular basis. The kind of things that would make, we were talking about earlier, a kind of a livable community instead of a compound mentality they were really missing. And so really, I guess the kind of the takeaway, and even early in my career, was that the more different we seem, the more we're actually the same in terms of what we're trying to achieve and the things we want for our families and the things we want for our communities. And it's when we strip things back and start to understand the more emotional connections and the more awareness of how the stories and the narratives have shaped that place we're working in and how important they are to understand the context, that actually you have a good success. And so the people that I met and worked with in the communities and other places in Pakistan, tribal elders and whatnot, like it really was just about sitting there, listening, and giving them the opportunity to tell me the things that were important to them, and to also tell them about my family and where I was from, and to relate to them, so that we built a sense of trust, and that they knew I wasn't working against them, but working with them to create more positive outcomes.
Yes, that makes a difference, indeed. Okay, so tell me about projects funding. From where and how do you get funds for small projects and interventions? As investors usually engage and seek promotion through bigger impacts, through bigger projects.
A lot of different ways that people invest in things to make it happen. One, there is kind of people power in terms of investment in the labor as the resource, which doesn't cost anything but your time. Then there's the investment which comes from people pooling their resources together, in terms of maybe I have the hammer and you have the nail, and we come together to build something together. And then there's also things like crowdfunding, which I think is really important as a kind of more localized way to generate investment funds in change. And two, there's also, I think there's an importance of, in the Pakistan complex, that's the importance of your community and those who are at your mosques, that they make a contribution back, which they do through zakat and other means. And so I think there's lots of different scalable ways. And I think what it has to start with, though, is human capital and the willingness of people to come together and put the resources that they do have together. Now, an interesting way to think about this too is if you and I went out and started to do a little intervention somewhere, maybe one of the neighbors comes out and gives us, and gives us something to eat or some water, or lets us use their amenities. And I think these are all, I think as a foundation, even more important than the money piece. The money piece can scale and make the pace of change more rapid, but without the human piece behind it, I don't think that, I think we can invest a lot of money in things that don't turn out to be anything because people don't have an emotional, or they have a connection to it, or they haven't bought into it from the start. And so I always encourage people to look at themselves first and then scale up from there. And if you really want to amplify it, then there's more of you that come to the table to talk. And I think the rate and pace of change we're currently seeing, people are coming together globally in their communities to do things which before they said we don't have any money to do this, to we don't need money to do this, we need each other. And I think that's a really important lesson, or a really important thing for people to understand, is it starts with you. And again, it's that the expression, which is never changes, that you are the change you want to be. You just need to scale that up to the community level.
Yes. Okay, so how important is it to invest in small businesses and share some personal experiences you have witnessed in communities' growth?
Sure. So investing in small businesses is absolutely vital to a community's resiliency. I think it's especially been apparent here in Australia during COVID-19 and through the recovery. And this has framed a lot of our thinking here in Australia in the last 6 months, especially. And so I think that there's an urgency and an opportunity around this idea that placemaking can actually be the catalyst to produce better economic outcomes for more people in more places. So that if we know that vibrant places encourage people to congregate and use their services, which would include local businesses, that this seems like the right approach. And so consulting with the local community, for example, on issues like what types of retail they like, or what services and employment opportunities that they would like to see in their community, helps ensure that we build communities that support and grow the local economy. And then two, we also know that well-designed spaces make people feel better, safer, and included. And this, in return, actually fosters greater local economic development. So again, talking about some of the things we were discussing earlier, if the quality of place leads to an attachment, and that attachment leads to higher economic growth, this is seemingly a simple concept. But I think that places that are sociable, accessible, and comfortable and full of activity, this is the driver of investment in community growth and investment in small businesses. People tend to also spend more money the happier they are, which I think really helps. And if you look back at what Fred Kent would probably say about this back when he was at the PPS, it's that when you focus on place, you do everything differently. And really, that sense of emotional and connection, emotional attachment and connection to your local community means, yes, in shopping locally and supporting local business to invest more in small business growth and to help them really frame that out. And so here across the country, we've seen numerous activities to support that, which have been come from local municipalities and whatnot, centered around. So we had an investment federally in helping do with wage support and things like that, but then also helping local businesses in terms of easing of policy restrictions, where it would be a huge process to go out and do a pop-up in front of their store, or to do a kind of parking space takeover for restaurants and things. That really, the policy and the constraints around that really seem to fall away. And what's amazing, of course, is it shows us that it was always possible. We just put things in place to stop it. And so these kind of things around the COVID-19 recovery, I really find fascinating, both locally here in Australia, but also globally, in terms of the level of investment we've seen in small business in particular to help keep them going has been absolutely critical. We have lots of restaurants here too who have went to a fully online service, fully takeaway service, and had the support even of other businesses in terms of helping them understand how to cope with that change when they didn't have a web presence, or they didn't have access to Uber Eats, GoGet, or Deliveroo. And so I think that the opportunity here for us as a society is to shift and reinvest in small businesses as opposed to kind of some of the bigger businesses which are more self-sustaining, and to realize that that's really what's at the heart of creating livable communities and sustainable and resilient communities, and to help encourage them to grow over time. So I probably have 1,000 examples and photos of how this has worked around the world, which I presented on elsewhere, but I think it's really important that we share these images and success stories as broadly as possible, so that other people who aren't as far along the pandemic recovery really can learn from them, and really get a sense of hope from how things can change and how things will change. And I think, if anything, as a silver lining out of one of a few silver linings out of COVID, is that the importance of local businesses, small businesses, has really come to the fore, and people are really reinvesting in their communities and their community resilience.
Yes, and sustainability has always been such a hit topic and important topic. And we have come to the conclusion that communities that invest in small businesses are more sustainable and more resilient, right? So, moving on, you have worked globally. So, what is your favorite city? Which is your favorite city or place in the world, and why?
Well, I don't particularly have a favorite city, and I do get asked this quite a bit. But what I do have some favorite places in various cities around the world, and I think I often tell people that, in all the good and great cities that we can think of around the world, what we do tend to think about isn't the city as a whole, but an aggregate in terms of its places that they're made up of. And they're all, I think I have ones that for me are tied to memories in terms of where I grew up in Vancouver, and around Stanley Park, which I think is one of the greatest and most beautiful assets of any city, to the first time I went to New York, and seeing things and feeling so completely overwhelmed by what was going on in Times Square that I immediately retreated to a much smaller and quieter space, to kind of seeing some of the new public realm around stations in Bangkok that were so incredibly, the movement of people was crazy, or new spaces in China, which as soon as they're built are taken over by people because there's such a demand and a want for space. And so I guess for me, it's really personal because I have all of these memories associated with them. But in saying that too, some of the favorite memories of some of the favorite places I have are those which I associate with my family and our kids, and places that we've visited and created our own memories that we can then attribute to that place. So, for example, having our kids in London and then taking them for walks through the Tower Hamlets and things like this, or on Penny Lane and Brick Lane, there's such great memories created around those places that the city is almost completely secondary to how I feel about the special places that are within it, or the special little nooks and crannies that I know about that nobody else knows about, that I can't wait to tell people about. So I have, again, a kind of almost encyclopedic volume of all these favorite places that I have around the world, that would form a very nice coffee table book to share with all my friends. But I think in terms of favorite cities, I think it's just more that there's lots of great cities around the world, and there's lots of, and even more, like, really great places that I really love, and I love spending time and feeling like I have a great connection to them. So that's not an answer to your question directly, other than to say that I think it's less important to focus on our favorite cities, and more important to think about what is it in these cities that's so important to us. And of Haley and Oscar and Ellie and I in the eyes, and it's just I love it, not because it's Hyde Park, but because we were there as a family doing this thing, and it was so great. Or different ones, kind of walking up Montreal and in Montreal, and different things. So I have so many. I don't think I could give you just one, and I think it would be unfair to all of the great places that I love so much.
Yes. So for Michael, company matters and family matters most. Spending time with them.
I think it does because yeah, it's about those connections. And I think too, when you like remember meeting a friend somewhere and having fun there, or you remember, so I asked you to close your eyes, think about the place. And a lot of times it's because you were there with other people too that mattered the most. And so there's so many different special places out there in the world that I think what's important is that we have them and that we go back to them and share them with other people.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on to our wrap up questions. What drives you and what keeps you focused on
Okay,
public spaces?
so everything I've just said is the short answer. I love seeing people derive joy and happiness from public spaces, and I love seeing people invest in them and do little things. Um, one of my favorite memories, ironically, in the context of COVID-19, is the kind of little alleyways in Wuhan when I was there last, where people take ownership of the laneways and they keep them clean, and they have a love of that place, and they want it to present something so great. We saw it again when Haley and I were in Jakarta. Some of the alleyways where people customize them with flowers and little ornaments and things, and they've taken ownership of it, and they've created. And I see places like this and I'm like, yeah, that's what I love about public space. I love that people can take ownership of it and really make it their own, and that too, it can really mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people in a lot of different times and places. And so I think that drives me to keep going. And just going back to what I said at the start about the power of place at bringing identity and people deriving identity from that place and influencing social norms. And I think that it's so remarkable, and that rather than, again, using what I said earlier, rather than looking at cities as kind of architectural museums, when you focus on the public spaces that are in them and what people do, where in the places where life actually happens, it really makes me feel like I'm in that I'm doing the right work. And even talking to people like yourself and others, and having this kind of this this interaction and this discussion, which is all about how much we love places and the hope and the opportunity that they provide. I can't imagine myself doing anything differently, and it really keeps me going.
Awesome. Okay. Share any experience or any memory that you have as a placemaker that makes you just happy, other than the Pakistan textbook store.
Of course, other than the Pakistan example, one of the things I have loved about COVID-19 is all the chalk drawings. It's been incredible to walk up and down the streets of Brisbane and in our community here, and just see people writing, everything will be okay, we're in this together, and all these messages of positivity coming from young kids who may not understand the full extent of what the pandemic has meant, but know that people are hurting and want to provide these positive messages without being even prompted, other than to get the chalk and get out there, and to really start to take back the public realm and focus on messages of positivity. And so I saw this a lot in the last kind of 12 to 18 months in particular, and it's really made me want to work harder at what I do to make sure that more people have access to the kind of places that I love talking about and that I love visiting, and that there's an equity to placemaking, or an equity to the amount of public spaces that every community has access to. So it's not just placemaking for the few, it's placemaking for the many, and that everybody feels like they have a right to inhabit public places.
Yes. And what was your struggling moment of this work, life, and placemaking, of course?
I've had many, many struggling moments in my career and in projects. And I think that I'm quite lucky. I'm very much a glasses half full kind of person. type of person, and so I'm forever the optimist. And working in different places in the Emirates and other places where you see your design, which has so much of yourself and the community embedded into it, and you see the kind of built outcome, and it somehow doesn't live up to the expectation, or something crazy has been done in its implementation or construction, and it's really disappointing, and you just think, why am I even bothering? And then again, you see somebody, freely moving across a kind of pedestrian crossing, or sitting with their kids talking in a public space. I don't know. And then you feel, well, okay, like there is a struggle, but if we did nothing, there would always be a struggle. So maybe the little bit of good work we're doing actually is going to amount to a lot of great work. And so, although we all have to feel hopeless or disappointed, I think that's part of the drive to do things better. And I think it should be part of all of our drive to do things better, because if we don't, then it will just stay the same. So I think in those moments of despair, I think we have to dig deep and grab something positive out of it.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so one of the favorite placemaking mantra of yours.
So that's a great question. There's a lot out there, and I've got two that I've been thinking about in the context of reflection and my travels and different things. And one is, again from Gelbert, it's an important one, because he says, cultures and climates differ all over the world, but people are the same. They'll gather in public if you give them a good place to do it. And this is absolutely what I think we've been talking about even tonight. And my other favorite one, which I remember from university, is that good design is no more expensive than bad design. And that was from Sir Alan Lane, the founder of Penguin Books. And I think the two of those together have really shaped and defined my thinking on placemaking and design and planning cities. And that, the people are different, sure, all over the world. Climates differ. What's winter here is summer somewhere else, but people are the same. Give them a place to gather, they'll do it. And good design done right, no more expensive than bad design. And I think these are two really resonate with me, and I bring myself back to them sometimes, just to kind of keep myself in check.
Yes, they are the guiding stars basically, and the good ones. Yes. Okay, so share your opinion about Pakistan or placemaking in Pakistan.
Sure. The incredible placemaking opportunity in Pakistan, both as a catalyst for positive systemic change, but as something which offers people more than they currently have in terms of creating livable communities and creating places where this kind of citizen-driven placemaking helps residents of a community feel like they can take ownership freely of unused or transient public space. So I think that this is the kind of the basis for the Pakistani placemaking movement to begin: small, affordable interventions that bring communities together around a common cause. I think it's a great way to start, and there's been some really good examples as well. And so I think too, there needs to be a strategic level intervention in Pakistan, particularly around safety in public spaces, particularly for women and children. And I think this needs to be addressed at this strategic level first and foremost, because it's one of the most, if not the most, essential ingredient for the creation of livable and prosperous cities. And so urban spaces, they need to be designed and managed in a way that make people feel safe and free from violence and crime. And there's also a direct relationship between perception of safety and public space. So when people take ownership of these places, whether they're transient or more established places, I think it helps improve the feeling of public spaces and the feeling of belonging, and that you can actually really be there. And so somehow we need to link the two together at the higher level with the strategy and a kind of a government policy towards placemaking, and then at the community level, or the more civil level, involving the kind of reclaiming of remnant public spaces that have fallen into disrepair, of which there are many, and converting these areas into local parks, local gardens, communal farms, urban agriculture. And so, the idea being that when you create these shared public spaces, is that it encourages them, citizens, to become drivers of change. And I think through the creation of these spaces, promoting inclusive, welcoming, safer places, really that it reinforces the sense of social inclusion, creates an opportunity for communities to organize and people to participate in preventing insecurity and violence. So there's actually some really cool examples. I think one example which I love is the Lahore Literary Festival. I think is great. One of the kind of best food festivals going right now is the Eat Food Festival in Islamabad, Lahore, and Karachi. I think it's CKO events or CKO architecture that put that on. And it's not just a food festival. I mean, it's got live culinary demonstrations. It's got painting. They have easels set up all around the grounds where people can just come and paint. The canvas is there, the paint's there, and people can just come and paint what they see, what they're imagining. Also it has performances in the evening. I think too that there's can't remember the year, but there was the Reclaiming Public Spaces One Bike at a Time project, which I thought was incredibly important, by the girls at Davos, which was a social justice kind of movement using bicycle takeover of public space with women as a way to address gender equality. Another great one is the Karachi Joyous Murals project, which is part of the Walls of Peace program, which the focus there was replacing negative and politically charged graffiti with ones that had positive values, such as peace, tolerance, and diversity. I mean, there's a lot of really good things going on in Pakistan already that just need to be brought together. In Lahore, they had a residual space under flyovers or expressways, that piloted some stuff in. So I think part of the problem is people don't know. I mean, thankfully, everybody has the internet now, and we can use that to our advantage to understand these things. But I think there really needs to be a community built around placemaking in Pakistan, and a lot of that's driven by even some of the stuff that you're doing. But I think people need to feel involved in it, and people feel a part of something bigger than themselves.
Exactly. You have done a very good, you have compiled so well, and yes, I appreciate that so much. Thank you so much for your work and for your efforts, for putting it forward and just bringing hope to the entire system. Okay, and so lastly, any message for the global leaders out there, as many young professionals are joining in?
Sure. The power of observation is incredibly underrated. And so one of my favorite examples is look at what people do outside ice cream shops. When you go in and you buy an ice cream, they usually don't have seats inside, right? So you go in, you buy your ice cream, and then because it's going to melt, you eat it outside of the shop. Placemaking. This is such an easy example, and the power of observation and understanding and harnessing that through observation into something good is really important. So we need to notice more about what's going on around us, is my point. And that, remembering that, it's not easy creating places with purpose and meaning always, and to make sure they're even used and well used by communities is even more important. And so this is where, again, temporary place activations, they help us foresee potential risks. They encourage the public to engage the space. And you know what? If it's not successful, we'll try something else somewhere else. And I think this is really, it's all doable stuff. And I love the idea that we just use the materials that we have to hand, both in terms of ourselves, in terms of that human labor, but also just in terms of found things, and create something in a found space. So I think, as a message of for young and up and coming placemakers in Pakistan, look around you, what's happening in the world, connect with people like you have globally, and start to see what things you can learn from them and get your little takeaways that you can actually do first outside your own house and then bigger. And you'll find that all of these small little things that you're doing, they start to add up to something big, which becomes a movement. And amplifying that movement becomes a lot easier when you're all working towards the same common goal of creating great places and to make people feel like they belong. And so I think that it's not that much more than that. And then just, other than to remember that it starts with connecting to each other. And that's where it starts, whether it's me or whether it's you. We all have to start somewhere, and I'm always happy to share my ideas with you and whoever else. And I hope if there can be anything taken away from this conversation, it's just that, again, you are the change you want to be. And I think it starts here and it starts now, and let's work together to create the places we want instead of the places we have. And I'm very happy to have been able to join you tonight and share my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much for your time and for this episode. It was lovely talking to you. I've learned so much, and I'm looking forward to more collaborations with you. So, yes, now we have ended. If you want to share
I
slides
can't
or what?
wait. I wanted to just show you some of my favorite things.
Yeah.
So, the Karachi Eat Festival is so great. And the fact that it's in 4 or 5 cities around the country, even better. You show me one person in this photo that is unhappy. Everybody's having a great time. Everybody's involved. Families are chatting, neighbors are chatting, communities are coming together. You've got the beautiful architecture in the background, but really you've just got all of this people milling about, talking to each other. There's no us or them. It's just people in one space enjoying something we all like, which is food. And I love this photo for this perspective that it shows of just everybody coming together and really enjoying the activity in the public space and the kind of multitude of different things around this. So I think for me, this is such a big moment when they had their fifth year anniversary in Karachi and had the biggest food festival that they'd ever had. And so I think that was one I found really moving. And then just the mural project, which, as I mentioned, really looked at covering. It was a university project which looked at covering up kind of these political and dissident messages and putting messages of positivity on them, and so that people walked by and, hey, had that spark of joy. And I love it so much, both in terms of the illustration style, but just in terms of the happiness on people's faces, even that have been painted in, and the colors of the city. And so it reminds people about that kind of texture of the city, and that there is hope in there too. The other one, of course, I wanted to go back and just find these kind of photos of Saeed and Jumbo Books, and because in Islamabad they still exist, and there's still a great opportunity here in the public spaces around them to share and help people understand that part of the history of Islamabad is actually in these bookstores, and these bookstores were so important too, where communities would come together and gather. Like I said before, I find it so fascinating. And of course, the original Said bookstore, and all the opportunity there. I mean, when I said the power of observation, I look at all of these photos, and I just see such an amazing opportunity to really and affordably create some great public spaces. The other ones I wanted to share with you are a bit more normal in terms of this sea of motorcycles that we have to deal with. But if you look past the sea of motorcycles, what do you see? An incredible market where life is there. People on the street are there. People are enjoying themselves. It doesn't matter what's happening above the buildings, what's happening with the bikes in front. It's about what's happening in that market. And the picture on the right, I wanted to show you too, because this was the typical example I give, where the entire thing is, I mean, where are you going to cross the street to go to your bookstore? You're not, right? And so actually sometimes accessing these spaces or these public place opportunities is impossible. And what we need to look at first is, how do we actually safely get people there and get people to be able to enjoy the places that may or may not already exist. The similar reflection here. I love this guy sitting on his motorcycle, kind of hanging out, and then this life that's happening behind him in the market. And then similarly too, it's a very kind of typical theme in so many of Pakistan's cities, where you just again have these great markets that exist and they go on at night and all hours. What would happen if we had a few tables and chairs here, just little plastic ones? What would happen if we didn't allow motorcycles to come through and actually allowed food stalls to kind of open up and spread out into the street? Just observations and noticing things and noticing where opportunities exist, where maybe it's something we've taken for granted. Maybe it's something we've looked at so much, we just need to look at it with fresh eyes. And of course, finally, as I said earlier, one of the best examples is ice cream. What do you see here? You see people gathering and hanging out because they don't want their ice cream to melt. You've instantly created a place and an active front. It just takes a little bit more kind of tables and chairs or reasons for people to gather, and you've got such an incredible space. And everybody's happy. They're getting their ice cream or their juice, and it just looks inviting, and it looks like, what, I want to go there, and I want to see, not only do I want mango ice cream, but I want to see what's going on and what people are talking about and share my experience with them. And I think that was really it, just the kind of 4 or 5 slides that I wanted to share with you as we ended, just kind of help you and your viewers kind of remember to harness the power of observation. Look at faces differently. If we always look at things the same way, they'll never change. So let's go out and let's find spaces, and then put up the picture and imagine what could it be, and then start small. Find that small intervention, and let's work together to make it happen.
Oh my God. I'm so happy to see these pictures. Thank you so much for your valuable insights. I love them all, and yes, this is the same way I used to think about the spaces. I love observing my spaces and the places. That's why I have the passion for making them better and bringing more people towards them. It was such a lovely talk. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for this episode, Michael. Take care. And yes, I'm looking forward to more.